Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail. I'm an attorney, public debater, and a speaker on religion and contemporary society. Now, if you've been following us over the past few weeks, this week in particular, we have indeed had an exciting lineup of a number of speakers, scholars, and indeed debaters discussing and unpacking different facets and aspects of Islamophobia. And today in our final segment, where we will attempt to deconstruct Islamophobia and, of course, its impact on society from an academic perspective, I've got the privilege and pleasure of having on the air Professor Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddique. Dr. Siddique is a professor, a researcher at Sheridan College. She conducts fieldwork in the areas of migration, race, ethnicity, and identity. Dr. Sabreena has been interviewed on CBC News, Radio Canada International, Toronto Star, and other media outlets to share her expertise on immigration issues. Contributions as an academic continue to make an impact on the policies relating to the equity of immigrants and racialized minorities in Canada. She's also very involved in community engagement and serves on the board of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women and the Pluralist Foundation as a senior communications executive, and is also on the advisory board of the Canadian Muslim Vote. Well, on our platform on ITV, on Souk Islam YouTube channel, on the platforms of Channel Islam International and Salam Media, it's my privilege and honor to have Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddique. Dr. Sabreena, assalamu alaikum, sister. How do you do?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
It's great to have you. A colleague of mine, in fact, did say and indicate that he would have, you apparently planned to come to South Africa, I believe, before the lockdown. And we hope to have you at some point in the future. Inshallah.
That's part of the plan.
Most definitely. I want to zero in onto this issue. You are a sociologist. I do understand that you're a criminologist. If we look and unpack, I mean, this term has been bandied around for some time. And if you look at many definitions, one individual that comes to mind is someone you may have heard, Professor Ziauddin Sardar. There's been individuals of the caliber of Edward Said and, contemporary John Esposito. The term Islamophobia, it's a Greek suffix. It denotes some sort of fear and aversion to, some kind of dread or an intense dislike. Is this a kind of a modern phenomenon? Because as I understand it, the term, in fact, existed in the French. The expression kind of gained currency in the 70s, and in a more modern sense, in the late 90s, even in the Arabic language, a kind of a contrivia, but something which is in popular parlance of usage in denoting the anti-Islamic sentiment that is existing in society today. How new is this phenomenon?
It absolutely isn't new, and you've kind of pointed to all the things I would have mentioned myself. Islamophobia also, I want to add, people don't like the term. A lot of times they'll say that I'm not comfortable with this term. I don't think it does justice to the impact that it has on Muslims, right? And marginalized Muslims around the world. But as academics and as someone who's written about this extensively, the way that I like to describe, the way the usage of the term and its contribution currently is that Islamophobia can be seen as this like umbrella, ideology, or, from a theoretical perspective, we can say that Islamophobia, the fear, leads to kind of that bigotry, the biases, the stereotypes about Muslims. So the thought process. So if there's an individual who thinks negatively about Muslims, this person has been fed and is kind of contributing to this idea of Islamophobia. But when it comes into practice physically, the term changes. We no longer use the word Islamophobia. So, anti-Muslim hate and violence does more justice to the physical impact and the violence on Muslim communities. So what I often say is that Islamophobia feeds the monster, and then anti-Muslim hate and violence is the monster that we see, doing all the destruction around us.
So I want to unpack this point, because I can understand the concern, for example, of hate crimes, and certainly, I mean, in a broad sense, people would, at the very least, condemn hate crimes, condemn anti-Muslim sentiment, which is actually realized at a physical level, particularly when it comes to either physical attacks, or you saw the incident in New Zealand, I think in 2018 or 2019, the shooting in the mosque. And I think in a general sense, whether you come from the far right, the far left, or from a conservative ideological perspective, people will at the very peripheral level attempt to obviously condemn these acts of violence. But from what I can see, and I think something which is more deeper, is that, within the Eurocentric and the Orientalist global power structure, and why I want to bring up the issue of Orientalism is that, the idea of Orientalism, as is defined by, people like Edward Said, and even before him, I think A.L. Tibawi and many other writers, is that it was a kind of a tool whereby individuals like the classical Orientalist writers would rationalize the necessity of the colonial project to deploy violence on, for example, countries under colonialism. And as an intellectual ideological tool, they would do this in order to achieve civilizational rehab of the so-called target Muslim communities, the target communities, by engaging in terms of affirming a global racial structure. And they would do this intellectually by means of writing about Islam, and writing it about the Islam, about the Quran, about the Prophet Muhammad from an intellectual point of view, from an academic point of view, which to a large extent still exists in universities around the world up to this particular point in time. Would that be an accurate understanding of a classical form of Islamophobia?
Absolutely. And I think what has also happened is, today's day and age where I think people are consumers of art more than they are of, intellectual writing. So, somebody might be able to, like your ordinary, average Joe in Canada has probably consumed more social media facts than they have actually read books about Muslims. So I'd say that Orientalist kind of tool of separating the East and the West and creating these caricatures of Muslims as barbaric individuals and Muslims as oppressed, this has played out in art, right? So in films, in television, in, more popular books. And that is now the consumption. The mass consumption that's happening is through that social media. So Orientalism has existed for a long time, but it has changed its form into a contemporary modern way of selling it. And it also translates into media narratives about Muslims. So, news media, print media. And so the average person is consuming all this content about Muslims, which is biased, and fed, and it's derived from this Orientalist mindset. And that's why Orientalism and Islamophobia is very much directly connected to the real lived experience of Islamophobic hate and violence. So, what happened in New Zealand, like you said, the ordinary person, the ordinary good person is going to turn around and say, that's terrible. Oh, I would never want something like that to happen to my fellow neighbor. It's terrible what happened. However, if that same person was in a survey and questioned about their feelings about Muslims and Islam, they would add to these numbers that we're seeing. Like, I think 46% or so of people in Canada actually believe in a lot of these stereotyped views about Muslims as being inherently violent, Islam being an inherently violent religion, and many other stats I can add to that. But if you look at perception surveys, I'm sure that you have some in South Africa and New Zealand as well. In Canada, perception surveys capture ordinary people's feelings and thoughts about Muslims, which aren't very far off from the lived violence that we see.
Well, I want to unpack that, but before I just move on to that, then could I ask this question? I mean, you're an academic. You at I believe, a Western institution, and certainly you are within the context of a university background. What as an academic project, then, what would be the kind of cultural reality of Orientalism in its modern context within the university enterprise. I mean, the one thing that kind of amazes me is that which I've made the point a few days ago with one of the previous guests, is that there's this kind of schizophrenic relationship. Whilst traditionally the Western universities have been dominated by individuals with a particularly biased approach in terms of studying Islam, providing an assessment about Islam. But when you look at some of the universities, a lot of them, I mean, they receive endowments from the Saudi government. You've got Georgetown University, which is led by Professor John Esposito, that's backed by the Saudi government, the same at Harvard itself, the Department of Islamic Studies. Do you see a shift in pattern in terms of who is controlling the discourse within the academic climate in terms of the study of Islam? Or do you just simply see a kind of a gloss that is put on that? Because, I mean, I see the schizophrenic relationship in the sense that on the one hand, you, for example, got the Department of Islamic Studies, which, for example, is supposed to provide a more moderate, balanced approach on the study of Islam. Yet, systematically to that, and in contrary to that, you, for example, have the Department of Anthropology or Sociology that would do the opposite in the very same university, where the material and the study of Islam and religion in general is inherently biased. What do you see the modern manifestation of the Orientalist enterprise, if we can call it as that, being at this particular juncture in the United States and certainly in your country?
So I'll just kind of give you like a personal anecdote or story to kind of add to that. Being an academic, once a PhD student, I think the easiest way to describe this is the fact that, academics who are in these institutions, their livelihood depends on funding and grants. Okay, so research, the only reason why we know what we know is because somebody funded a study so you could find out the truth, okay? And the way I see it, and from my own experience, projects that are about radicalization, extremism, ISIS, the war on terror, anything that feeds that Orientalist project will get funding in 2 seconds. If you are conducting a study that distorts some of those stereotyped kind of, views about Muslims, you don't get the funding. And that is the place where I feel like where we're at in academia, that juncture is where the problem exists. And I can tell you my own experience of, within the academic system, where I've had projects within within my department that were declined funding because the study didn't feed the narrative, the Orientalist narrative, where I was looking at my study, particularly at that time, was looking at the ways in which faith-based spaces, third spaces, were places of belonging and identity for Muslims, important places. And it was looking at how mosques should not be seen as a place of radicalization or de-radicalization, but places that create, healthy Muslims, healthy, happy Muslims. Right. So it has nothing to do with radicalization. Like, I wanted to take the focus away from this idea that Muslims are either really, really extreme and radical, or they leave Islam and, they just blend into, Canadian society. So my project was not a fun project for them. It wasn't something interesting. And, also the same thing happens with feminist researchers, right? So Muslim feminist researchers and academics, unless they're talking about honor killings and talking about the hijab as an instrument of oppression, it's very difficult to get funding because you're not feeding this narrative that problematizes Muslim men as oppressors and Muslim women as victims of oppression. And the same goes for popular books. You see platforms given to individuals who are breaking free of the shackles of, Islam and the oppression of Islam. And they're given book deals, they're being interviewed by night show hosts around the world, right? Like TV, because because that feeds the narrative. But where do we hear stories about women who, whether they wear hijab or don't wear hijab, but they their stories go against this popular narrative about Muslim women being oppressed.
Yeah. So it seems that you're walking then a very tight rope as an academic in terms of what you can and cannot discuss. And it seems to me also that whilst the far right makes they make the claim that the term Islamophobia has, in a sense, been weaponized by Muslims as a tool that Muslims use to beat them into intellectual submission to prevent any kind of further critique on Islam. The reality of the situation is not that. I mean, in the States, in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe too, if you are labeled an anti-Semite or targeted as an anti-Semite or anti-Jewish, or even, for example, remotely, and why I'm bringing this as a kind of a parallel process, if you're remotely viewed as criticizing the state of Israel, you can be quickly labeled as an anti-Semite. Your academic career can be placed into jeopardy. Your journalistic integrity can be brought into question. But that same thing, doesn't apply when it comes to Islamophobia, which is a reality, but hasn't been accepted within the dominant mainstream as being a phenomenon that indeed exists. So the point being made is that the duplicity is here, is that a critique, for example, against a political ideology, Zionism, is viewed as anti-Jewish sentiment or anti-Semitism, whereas illegitimate forms of critique against Islam and Muslim, whilst defined as Islamophobia, is not recognized as such by the mainstream press, by the governments, the United States government more particularly, although we'll come to your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. But it's not recognized as an existing phenomenon. It's just simply used as a basis for suggesting, you Muslims are using this as a tool to attack us, to beat us down, to prevent us from criticizing you and raising these issues on honor killing. So this is a hypocrisy, the mendacity that seems to be part and parcel of this existing project, which is an irony because Muslims are now increasing in number in the West, in the United States, and in Canada, for that matter. Why does this still continue?
So I want to answer that by explaining how the Islamophobia industry stays alive, the fuel for it, right?
Yeah.
The fuel for the Islamophobia industry globally is the threat of Islamist violence and terrorism. As long as this is a real threat and a real problem for civilized countries, Islamophobia is never going to be taken seriously. And the industry is a global industry because Modi's government in India really benefits from Muslims being described as terrorists and seen as a real threat. So it's an industry, it's a machine that keeps going and is fed constantly, and it helps them with their political movement that they have. And the same thing for Israel. As long as Palestinians are seen as a legitimate threat and seen as violent people, Israel has every right to defend itself against that threat. So the moment that Palestinians and Palestinian governments are, not seen as terrorists, everything that Israel is doing is going to be target for human rights violations, right? But if they're seen as legitimate threats and terrorists, so what I'm trying to say is that Islam and terrorism, as long as they are linked together, Islamophobia will never, ever be seen as a legitimate problem. And I mentioned Israel and India, but there's America. There's a lot of countries around the world that, for them, their political motives and their political kind of policies, they rely on Muslims being defined as terrorists. And as long as that definition exists, Islamophobia will not be legitimate.
What would the response then be? Because if the argument is then made that, look, notwithstanding the fact that Israel is a belligerent state, and obviously I would argue an illegitimate state at that, India is a belligerent far-right fascist state. And of course, there are alliances that are established with the far right in the United States, in Canada, certainly in Western Europe, which is now increasingly disturbing in terms of what is happening there. What would the response then be to these same belligerent outfits that are making the claim that there is indeed an Islamist threat and that there is indeed a terrorist threat? Because the one end of the spectrum is that, well, certainly you do see acts of Muslim violence that are taking place within a properly a certain political context or a climate, or as a result of, for example, invasions that have taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan, which gave rise to this kind of radicalism. What would you say as a counter argument to the claim that, look, we need to take this approach? You've got these institutes, the Center for Security Policy, Jihad Watch, Stop Islamization of America, and all of them. They exist to show the fact that Islam is a threat. The Islamist threat is real. The terrorist threat is there. And indeed, we are dealing with a violent, inherently violent ideology, which is Islam, that seeks domination over the United States and all non-Muslims. What would the response to that then be at an intellectual level?
So what I just wanted to respond to like the earlier part of your comment just now. So this is why I say that Orientalism, the threat of Islamists as terrorists, and Islamophobia and the lack of policy related to Islamophobia exists. There's a connection between these three. As long as Orientalism and the way it plays out, and this is why I said it was very important for us to understand not the intellectual Orientalism, but the new age, modern day, artistic Orientalism, that is more powerful than intellectual Orientalism, actually. Because your average person is not reading, The Clash of Civilizations, right? They're not reading these intellectual pieces and papers and books. They are mindlessly, robotically taking in social media and art through films, through advertisements, that's what they're taking in, right? So modern day Orientalism is not the Orientalism of intellectuals. That feeds this definition and this idea that Islam and Muslims are a threat to the civilized world. And then that then feeds the illegitimacy of Islamophobia, or the lack of, the idea that Islamophobia is not really, I wouldn't say that it's not real, because I think people are believing that it's real. Right. So because when you see acts like New Zealand mosque shooting, the Quebec mosque shooting, the London family in Ontario getting run over by, a racist Islamophobe. So they see it as real. They say, how I would describe it as a researcher in this field, your ordinary person is not a bad person who thinks that this didn't actually happen. Yes, it happened, but they weigh one against the other. So they say that, okay, Islamophobia is real and it's really bad, but terrorism is way worse. Islamic terrorism is so bad. So we can't just stop worrying about Muslims as being terrorists and, Islam inherently being an oppressive and violent religion, because if we, stop worrying about that, more people will die. That's how I see it playing out. And the only response to this, which is the second part of your comment I'm going to answer, the only response to this is distorting popular Orientalist expressions and depictions of Muslims as inherently barbaric, as terrorists, which is what we're seeing is happening through art. Like, you have artists like Riz Ahmed, actor Riz Ahmed, who is making films that distorts those ideas, right? We've got books being written that are not like the Ayan Hirsi Ali type of books. We've got books that are showing regular Muslims like you and me, who, I may not wear hijab, but I'm a practicing Muslim. Because the problem is that focus has just been on Muslim women who wear hijab or Muslim women who leave Islam. Where are the Muslim women who don't visibly look Muslim according to certain, definitions, but they are just like regular people, academics, artists, chefs and bankers, like that whole area, which is the largest area of Muslims, is missing. It's missing in our ordinary consumption of Muslims.
So it seems to me, and this is, I like the term which you've used, New Age Orientalism, which is manifest in popular culture, if you want to call it that, through social media. But then it seems to me that it takes me back to something that I initially wanted to raise with you somewhat, is that then the purveyors of this or the promoters of this are in fact the technocrats. If you're looking at people like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, or what's her name, Wachowski on, I think Susan Wachowski, the head of YouTube, or on Instagram. I mean, it seems, we're living in a kind of an information highway of infotainment on social media, which is controlled by the technocrats and the popular culture that is manifest in Hollywood and in the popular entertainment, not controlled or dominated by intellectuals, but by these technocrats, by these movie moguls and controllers of popular culture that are manifesting their ideas out there. And of course, to distort that, we don't have an equal playing field. So we don't have an equal playing field. Now it's so common. During the lockdown, any comment that you make can be so easily shut down. Either on YouTube, you are censored. On Facebook, you are censored. So you don't have an equal playing field to counter the existing narrative. And that becomes a problem in terms of making your position and articulating it more manifest based on this unequal playing field that you see. Would I be correct in that?
I think so. And I think I just want to kind of, reinforce this idea that, I feel like our focus has been on the wrong things for a long time. This is me just speaking as a Muslim, as a member of the Ummah, right? I think that we lacked vision in the sense that art can have the impact that it has had. So we have not really gone into these spaces as members of as journalists and reporters and so I'd say immigrants in the West, right? And children of immigrants in the West, fed by this internal colonialism, right? That we've all been a part of. My parents, your parents, and other elderly immigrants wanted to see their children become doctors and lawyers and engineers and professors, and because it was like this idea of status, right? That if we were in these positions of higher status, that we would have some power and we'd have some influence, and maybe that way our voices will be heard. What happened was, was it lack of vision? Was it just because we were new immigrants and we weren't there yet in terms of our understanding? We didn't infiltrate, or we didn't become part of spaces that were going to be powerful in ways that we didn't understand. In social media, in art, in TV, and film. And, so that's when now I would say, when somebody says to me, how do we fight Islamophobia? How do we kind of counter these narratives? For me, it actually is art. And I do think that these are the spaces where we need to. This is the only way where we can counter, Orientalist depictions of ourselves. And, I would like to add that, this, what you talk about, this kind of New Age Orientalism through art, we see it everywhere. So in India, and, I've given you some personal information here, but I used to be a Bollywood fan when I was younger. I used to watch a lot of Bollywood movies. And there are now studies coming out, and something that I had noted myself for years, that Bollywood films promote Islamophobia by constantly showing Muslims Pakistanis, specifically because of the hate towards Pakistan, as terrorists. Same thing with Israeli film and television. If you are ever to go and look at Israeli film and TV, what this indoctrination of ordinary Israeli citizens is that Arabs are terrorists. You could just go on to like Netflix and look at some of the popular Netflix series that have been made and the films that have been made. So there's this indoctrination that's happening, which, happened in Nazi Germany. It happened in Germany, where ordinary good people were indoctrinated to truly believe that Jews were a threat. And it was done through film and television and books and, things that at the time it was books and radio. And
I think there were satirical cartoons on Jews, in the, I think in the rise of the Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and the same thing towards the Kenyans, the Mau Mau in Britain, when they were demonized as big black monsters and so on. How long has this been going on in Bollywood? I mean, I'm not a fan. I have seen one or two, but I'm not a fan. Has this been all the time? Because I know in the context of Hollywood, it seems to be a phenomenon. When I look at, and I've been discussing this with some of the other guests, is that it seems to be that in the 80s, I mean, if you look at some of the earlier, even the James Bond movies, the one that came to mind, A View to a Kill, where a Bond is in partnership with the Mujahideen against the Russians, the Soviet threat. Sylvester Stallone is fighting with the Mujahideen against the Russians. So it was always a cold threat that was manifest in Hollywood, but that changed in the late 90s after the Gulf War. Has this been the position in Bollywood? Because I would assume that there were a lot of leading Muslim actors within Bollywood society that would have at least have been influential in terms of dictating the narrative and structure of filmmaking, as an example? Or is this also something which is newly emerged in recent years?
You've probably heard this idea that, film and TV, it's like a window to the world, right? It's a window to the world. Oftentimes people have this question, are you looking out or are people looking in? Like, what came first? This is this whole chicken and the egg type of situation.
Sure.
Is film a mirror of society, or is society a mirror of film? Like, are they influenced? The truth is, it's a two-way stream. It's both ways. And with Bollywood, and, I've done film studies and I use a lot of film and television in my teaching as a sociologist. So I'm speaking now as someone who's educated in this area as well. So just looking at Bollywood, in the 40s and the 50s, the way Bollywood was a mirror of its the environment and culture at the time, which was this newly made India. And, the fight was against the British, the colonizers, freedom and independence. So the films depicted that, it was this sense of like, nationalism towards India, your country. And so a lot of the films at the time, and there was poverty at the time, a lot of socioeconomic impacts of the partition. So the films were very much focused on that. The stories were all about that. A love story, backdrop would be poverty, post-independence, post-partition, societal issues. Then in the 80s and the 90s, we saw this shift, and, we now know that Bollywood films were funded a lot by, at the time, drug lords, right? Drug lords, underworld, they were funding these films. And if you look back and look at the films from the 90s, they all had a very similar theme, love and pining and, society coming in between lovers and, them wanting to be together. And it was really a depiction of these poor people who are rising up against the elites, right? And it was the story of the ordinary man, the struggle of the ordinary man. And there was a lot of focus on these love stories in the 90s. And this unfulfilled love. But as soon as you look at the late 90s and the early 2000s, you see this shift in Bollywood films where you see more and more films that are nationalistic. And it was very anti-Pakistan narrative. It was very creeping initially, and it became more and more pronounced. The more you look at the film, the popular films being made at the time was very much anti-Pakistan, very much nationalistic. And this focus shifted towards terrorism, which was a global focus at the time as well. The late 90s, early 2000s became the threat of terrorism from Muslims, and not just Muslims in Pakistan, Muslims in, Middle Eastern countries, Muslims within your own country, like homegrown terrorists. So you could see this global focus on Muslims as terrorists and terrorism being a big threat. So what I would say is that films have an impact on ordinary citizens who don't really know that this is what's happening, that films are being influenced by funders. They just think that, oh, wow, this is a problem. Terrorism is a problem. The films have an impact on people's mindsets and then their own biases towards people. And that's why I say that art is so powerful, because it has this creeping effect on you, where it slowly infiltrates your mind and it makes you believe certain truths are truths.
It seems to have been exacerbated then by the Modi administration, I think, in terms of
Absolutely.
Controlling the discourse and narrative, and far more prominent and in your face at this juncture. If I may move on then to ask then what in the circumstances, that's one aspect, but there are, for example, in Canada, I believe, in the United States, think tanks that are in many respects still responsible for orchestrating the majority of anti-Islamic messages that's polluting the national discourse. Now, if you can name them, the Center for Security Policy, the one led by Frank Gaffney, Society of Americans for National Existence, Daniel Pipes, the Middle East Forum, Robert Spencer, who I've had personal engagement with, of Jihad Watch. You've got Pamela Geller, and then, of course, you've got the Act of America. And when I look at some of the funding that these characters, in fact, receive, I saw a report, for example, which seemed to suggest that Act for America, I think it's the organization that was funded by or led by Brigitte Gabriel, the Lebanese American, they had access to something like $204 million in revenue over a period, I think, of about 4 or 5 years, in helping to push for legislation targeting Muslims. What role do these think tanks have in popular culture, or do they primarily have an influence in terms of influencing policy, dictating policy? I mean, people, for example, make the claim that under the Trump administration, he was very Islamophobic, and he had this, the guy's a loony. He had this rhetoric that he was speaking about. But under the Obama administration, the situation globally was even worse. I mean, you'd have a situation where you'd have drone strikes on Muslim nations, attacks on third world countries, a far more vicious and vindictive foreign policy approach, even though they claim to be Democrats. So the question I want to ask you is that what role do these think tanks have? Because they're still there, they're heavily funded, and they seem to have a far more meaningful impact when it comes to shaping and influencing policy decision-making by governments.
Absolutely. And, I would add, it's not just that they're still there, they are more in number today than ever before. So they're growing. It's there's a rise. We have seen a rise. Just
the funding, where does the funding come from? I mean, there's a lot of money. You're looking at hundreds of, Daniel Horowitz, I mean, he pumps in millions per annum, to some of these smaller think tanks.
So this is where I would say intellectual Orientalism meets popular New Age and, social media Orientalism, where you get intellectuals and elites who have the money, and they have bigoted views. They have these bigoted views about Muslims. And then they fund the people on the ground. They're the ones who are doing all the legwork, the people working for these think tanks, producing articles, surveys. They create these legitimate looking surveys about Muslims and the threat of terrorism in Islam. And then they push them out to impact ordinary citizens and to make them think that, Muslims are a threat. But I'm glad you mentioned Pamela Geller, because I did want to kind of focus on this, because we've been speaking a lot about terrorism. And that is Orientalism that, so Orientalism has two parts, where the Muslim man, the Middle Eastern man, is depicted as this barbaric beast, this violent person. But then there's the Muslim woman, or the Orientalist image of the Muslim woman is an oppressed woman, as a victim, right? And the terrorist narrative, the Muslim terrorist narrative, kind of forwards that idea that Muslim men are barbaric. And then Pamela Geller and her type, they will promote this narrative that Muslim women are victims, oppressed victims, and that's where, when she focuses on honor killings, and she focuses, on this idea that Muslim women are being oppressed by these barbaric men, and what's inherently Islam being inherently a violent religion. So these think tanks and these intellectuals and these people who are, orchestrators of the global Islamophobia industry, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just that Muslim men are terrorists, or we have to worry about extremist violence. We also have to worry and really care about Muslim women, and that's our human, that basically feeds and touches and targets human beings' emotions and empathy, right? So it will focus on the ordinary person's empathetic nature to worry about another human being. So for those who don't care about terrorism and war and, some of these more technical parts of the narrative, they will really be drawn into the human aspect, to, ordinary women being, or Muslim women being, oppressed. And that's why with this whole, what we saw with Afghanistan and people's support, for Afghan women over the last 20 years has really been about Pamela Geller narrative, basically that narrative that we need to worry about these women because they need us. And this is white women feminism, right? White women feminists that will paint Muslim women as oppressed. And in Canada, Bill 21, I don't know if you know much about this policy, Bill 21.
I was going to come to Bill 21, the one in Quebec,
yes,
which impacts on the dress code that you wear in your workplace, which is quite ironic because Justin Trudeau apparently speaks out purportedly against Islamophobia, but that seems to be imposed in Quebec, as if I got it right, where this is now a new law that's been passed as a bill. It hasn't been passed. I don't know what the status
it has. It's been passed. It's been enforced. We just had, a recent case just a couple of weeks ago where a Muslim teacher was removed from the classroom in front of her students because she was wearing a hijab. And, that became a big case. And now, we have people speaking up against it. But, what's interesting about this whole thing is that it comes off of this idea of laicite, which is, separation of religion and state. And, so it all stems from this idea that we don't want religion to be part of, these institutions, right? So schools and government institutions. And the idea is, on the surface, the bill proposes that articles of clothing or articles that show religion should not be part of any institution, government institution, right? Like schools and civic institutions and all of that. So people are saying that, well, it's all, this kind of like includes all religions, but it doesn't really include all religions because really the bill targets Sikh men because of their turbans and Muslim women because of their hijabs. So it's a very targeted bill. It also says that you can't wear a cross, you can't wear a necklace that has a cross on it, but that could easily be put inside your sweater. So really who it targets are Sikh men who wear a turban and Muslim women who wear a hijab. So, that's why Bill 21 has now been kind of exposed as a very Islamophobic and anti-Sikh and, anti-immigrant kind of bill that's targeting people who look visibly different, who appear visibly different.
So as I understand, Dr. Sabreena, is that Bill 21 prohibits public servants, or if you're a teacher, you're a police officer, prison guard. Apparently, I'm told that if you're a lawyer, crown prosecutor, for example, or a teacher or principal or a doctor in a hospital, a public hospital, I would assume, and you're a Muslim woman, you can't wear the headscarf. Would I be correct? Would it be? Of course, they may have an issue on the niqab, but are you not even allowed to wear the headscarf as a Muslim woman? Yes. And if you wear the headscarf, what's the consequences of that? If you are involved in your day-to-day activities as a nurse or as a teacher, what will happen? Is it a criminal offense?
Yes, you are removed from that position. You lose your job, basically, right? So Immediately. So with this particular woman a couple of weeks ago, teacher who was taken out of her position as a teacher, and she was moved to, interestingly, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, right? So not only is she being stripped of her right to, teach and wear a headscarf, she is now being, and this is what I often talk about as a feminist, talking about Muslim issues, is that Muslim women are not only made to be these victims, but they're also exoticized to some extent, right? So there's exoticism as well.
I want to just focus on that because, I don't know much about the Canadian legal system. What I can say as a lawyer in South Africa is that bill would never have met any form of constitutional muster in this country based on as much as you can speak about the corruption and what's going on in South Africa, and we in an extremely tumultuous period, that aspect would not pass muster at any level. Do you not have an ultimate Supreme Court of Appeal where this has been challenged at some level? Do you have a Canadian constitution where the equality and discriminatory element of this provision has been challenged or is in the process of being challenged?
Right now, it is in the process of being challenged. So you're absolutely right. There are challenges to it. The problem that we're seeing right now is that prominent politicians are not taking a strong stance against it. And that is also because we've got some issues with Quebec. Quebec almost exists like another country within Canada in terms of how it functions and how it operates politically, right? It's almost like a standalone government, believe it or not, because of the history between the French and the English and, the splitting away and all of that. So a lot of politicians they won't speak on it because they don't want to get involved in Quebec politics and the laws there, which is a problem.
What's your prime minister said? Justin Trudeau, I've seen some of his tweets where he purportedly gives the idea of, Canada being a multicultural, pluralistic society. But it seems to be running extremely hollow when you look at his own country and a province within his country where this duplicity and hypocrisy is just so manifest large. Surely this just simply is a question of the usual hypocrisy of politicians and your prime minister again on that level.
Absolutely. Contradictions, hypocrisy, all of these words are, coming out now. People are being called out on it. But this also kind of speaks a little bit about what we call Canadian exceptionalism, where around the world, we are kind of seen as this multicultural, lovely country where everybody gets along, everybody says sorry, everybody says thank you, we're very polite. And, what adds to that are these strange, memes and jokes that went around when Trump was elected and all these people were like, I'm moving to Canada. I'm packing my bags and moving to Canada. And, Canadians like myself who are in the social justice field, we'd kind of laugh, but also get a bit annoyed by these tweets that were coming out because we're like, there's this misconception, right? Because of this multiculturalism, platform that we're on, where we're seen as this how multiculturalism works very well, a country that, does things right. We tend to brush a lot of our problems under the rug, and people don't get to see them. But people like myself now are speaking out openly about Bill 21 and other incidences. I mean, even with what happened after the Quebec mosque shooting and with the recent London family killing, we have been speaking up about the fact that there has been no policy change since then. I mean, we look to New Zealand, right? And Jacinda Ardern as, and somebody from within New Zealand might turn around and say, well, even that is kind of like a misconception. We're not as great as we appear to the world. But we looked at Jacinda Ardern and say, well, there have been policies that have been put in place since the New Zealand mosque shooting that, prevent something from that happening again, which hasn't happened here. Other than some Islamophobia grand meeting, anti-Islamophobia grand meeting that took place in July, there has been nothing put in place. I mean, we're still arguing if Islamophobia is a real thing or not. That's where we are right now. We still have politicians saying, it's not as bad as they claim it to be. Which comes back to Orientalism.
I want to, because, rest assured, I will ensure that Pamela Geller gets this interview and Robert Spence as well. But I want you to address one aspect because it's important. You raise the issue of Western feminism, white woman feminism, as you call it. And the argument that is being made by the Islamophobia industry is this, by the Islamophobia industry and by people that are represented by Pamela Geller, Brigitte Gabriel, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I have no qualms in describing them as bigots. The argument that is being made by them is that their concern is Muslim women. And for example, I'm not so sure of all these cases, but they will, for example, raise a point, not in third world countries necessarily, but the fact that in the United States and in Canada, it's concealed by the mainstream media that, for example, honor killings are rampant within immigrant communities, or that you've got incidences of severe cases of domestic violence. I think there's a Rifka Barry case and so on. And the issue is that this cannot be viewed as Islamophobic because it is in fact inherently showing care and supposed concern for the rights of Muslim women and the oppression that they've been subjected to and so on. Is this a condescending approach? Is this in itself, the so-called care that they have, in itself a condescending, demeaning approach, reflecting the kind of everything that is fundamentally rotten to the core with Western feminism and indeed the Islamophobic industry, and the fact that the reality of the situation is that most of these incidences are purely isolated. I mean, it's not it's not an endemic phenomenon that, honor killing is now inherently part of Canadian Muslim culture or American Muslim culture. A lot of the Muslims, in fact, happen to be Caucasian, Afro-American Muslims, and of course, a small minority of Pakistani, Indian, and so on. Well, what would your response be to that, this particular approach? You probably heard this all the time, that it can't be Islamophobic. We care about Muslim women.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, just to kind of like add to, there was a prominent lawyer, Pamela Cross in Canada, and she did this study in 2013. And in her report, she basically concluded that Muslim women are no greater risk of honor killings and violence and domestic violence than the average Canadian woman. So her study basically said that, it wasn't that Muslim women don't have honor killings or domestic violence. It's just, it's no greater than any other woman, which basically points to this idea that domestic violence is a problem, but it's a problem across the board, across society, across cultures. And in Canada, embarrassingly, we have stats that prove that Indigenous women are far more likely to be victims of domestic violence, domestic violence, but also violence from the greater community than any other group. And also Muslim women, so studies have shown that Muslim women are far more likely to be on the receiving end of Islamophobic violence than any other group. So when you look at hate stats, Muslim women are on the receiving end of more violent hate than any other hate group, as well as Indigenous women. So we've got studies to prove all of this. However, like you said, it's the focus on honor killings, because these are juicy stories. They're sold as juicy stories. They're interesting. They're given this like very kind of like, narrative, approach to storytelling approach in the media where, the way it's presented is, it paints Muslims as a group and immigrants as a group as inherently backwards and conservative and oppressive. And we must free these women and save these women, which adds to the white savior complex as well. So we've got the white savior complex, and it's compounded when you add white feminists to it. They want to be white savior feminists. Right? Is
feminism a problem? Is feminism a problem? I remember when we studied, we were doing, I think, sociology or legal diversity, but one aspect of it was feminism, and the discourse that we studied and in the academic works and the writings, it was extremely demeaning in the sense that it kind of commodified Muslim women as being creatures that required some degree of salvation. Now, the point being made is that is that inherently a problem as an ideological phenomenon? Feminism or Western first world feminism has always been demeaning of the non-West, and in a sense, it's been an appendage to the colonial project. Feminism has always been an appendage to the Western colonial project, particularly when it dealt with third world countries, natives, and they describe it in demeaning terms, more specifically, a constant attack on the culture of the other, if you could call it as that.
So some scholars might turn around and say, well, feminism has done such good for women all around. We can't just disparage the entire movement because obviously it's because of feminism that women can vote and this and that and blah, blah, blah. I, as a scholar today, am able to say to you quite safely that I think white feminism is harmful. It's actually harmful for non-white women. And same goes for the hashtag #MeToo movement. The hashtag #MeToo movement revealed how elitist it was, because the ordinary, let's say, a blue collar, or, let's say somebody who was a domestic help, let's say, or somebody who worked in certain industry, a racialized woman. Could a racialized woman say hashtag #MeToo and tweet something out without the fear of losing her job? Could like a racialized Black Muslim, add any intersection into that, turn around and take part in a march without losing her job or her credentials or her credibility? No, it was a white woman's movement.
Elitist white women's movement. I mean, within Hollywood, within the political spectrum.
Class and race. It was at the intersections of class and race. So you had to be a rich white woman to really benefit from hashtag #MeToo. And I think that in some ways did more harm, for those who were not in the position to benefit from it. I actually feel like rather than saying that they just didn't benefit from it, in many ways it did harm for them. And just like white feminism that looks to save Muslim women, it dehumanizes Muslim women. It reduces them, like you said, as commodities, like as as voiceless creatures who can't speak for themselves, that they need to be saved by white women. And there have been going back to films, there have been numerous films made about this as well. The white woman who travels to a faraway nation where she's saving the women there from the oppressive men. The number of films that have been made about, women in Iran being stoned to death. Look, this is not to say that oppression doesn't exist in these places. The argument I'm making is similar to what the academic in Canada said, that it's a problem, but it's a problem everywhere. It's not isolated to Muslim women. It's not isolated to these racialized communities, so much so that we need to stop and say, these are the women that need saving. These are the women who are most oppressed. It's just
the irony is that it's the rich white men that actually control the discourse. I mean, the cynicism of the Me Too movement, the very same individuals that were speaking out against, for example, the case of Harvey Weinstein, or, in the Jeffrey Epstein saga. I mean, these were the individuals, the same women were hypocritically lauding the man a couple of years back. And those same men who control the discourse, for example, within the climate culture of Hollywood, the Weinsteins, through his Miramax entity, would make these movies of the white woman saving and salvaging women in third world countries and so on. I mean, you couldn't make up the cynicism of the entire exercise. It's like a one vicious cycle. And so that raises a question, is that it seems to me that the woke movement, or the new woke, has appropriated or kind of formed an alliance with the Me Too movement. I mean, and a lot of these, there's also an alliance with leftist organizations. Muslims, you see, for example, many Muslim women, for example, one that comes to mind, Linda Sarsour, and many others. Are there negative ramifications and consequences in the long term with siding with such movements, the Me Too movement, the woke movement, bearing in mind that there is, in certain instances, an ulterior agenda that a lot of these particular organizations have, and then when it comes to the shove, they'll simply leave you hanging, and they don't really have true concern for the lives of Black people or Black women or other race groups for that particular matter. It's an elitist, white, globalist enterprise here, which is just simply a manifestation of the colonial project in another way.
And it's exploitative, monetary exploitation, as well as exploitation of, a person's humanity, right? I would say that the problem of some of our people on our side joining some of these movements, the reason why and the attraction to it is this whole diversity, equity, inclusion element. It's tokenistic. So a lot of these grand movements realize that they are on a global stage being judged for their diversity, equity, inclusion practices. So in order to appear very diverse, they will approach people like Linda says. They need Muslim women, especially visibly Muslim women. And this is something I can tell you I have felt. There are a lot of times where I am not approached for an interview because I don't wear a hijab. And I've had reporters say to me, we're specifically looking for a hijab wearing woman to speak about this issue, because I don't fit the Orientalist narrative, right? I'm not the stereotype. And a lot of times I will speak on, I've given interviews in, prominent interviews, and I've had people turn around and say, she doesn't look Muslim. She doesn't sound Muslim. How does a Muslim woman look and sound? I distort a lot of these stereotypical images that they have been fed over the years. Would Linda Sarsour, I mean, names that come to mind, Adina Lekovic, you probably heard of her, the Muslim Public Affairs Committee. Linda Sarsour is one example. You've got Ilhan Omar and Dalia Mugahed, Yasmin Mugahed is an example. Would they fit the stereotypes by virtue of the fact that they're wearing the hijab? Does that, because I mean, wouldn't they
go against these stereotypes, the fact that they are able to articulate their position despite wearing the hijab, which is traditionally viewed as, if you wear the hijab, you can't articulate, you're inarticulate, you're oppressed, and so on. They would break that stereotype. I mean, the fact that they're wearing the hijab itself.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. And you've named some of my heroes. You know, some of these women you have named. I know some of these women personally. I would call them friends, and I would say that they are definitely breaking those stereotypes. But in some ways, you know, the point that I'm trying to make is that having Muslim women who wear a hijab appear in an interview or a show or be part of a movement, it makes the organization look more diverse. Yeah. It makes them look better. So the point I was trying to make with that is that the lure to approach women like them and to have them join your team, and then the kind of allure for some of these women to join is that, and I fell into that trap too many times, where I felt like, you know what, I should be a part of this because it's better. You know, I would rather have somebody from a racialized background, a Muslim background, to be part of something like this, because otherwise it's all a bunch of white men and women, you know. And I have asked Black people to come, Black women, scholars, to be part of organizations, because I've wanted there to be better diversity, equity, inclusion, at least on the surface. But what I'm trying to point to is surface level diversity, equity, inclusion, and deep, you know, kind of deeper level. And it really has taken a lot of Black Muslim women to tell me and point it out to me and make me realize that we can't just be okay with surface level, you know, change. Unless we're seeing that deep anti-racism work being done in these organizations, it's pointless. We're feeding that exploitation by being a part of these. Unless we're demanding there to be deep change, you know, and by that I mean, and you know, a very wise Black Muslim woman said to me one time, you can't invite Black people to come into a dirty house. You know, when you have a dirty home, you can't invite people to it. You have to first clean up, then you invite them. And that's the problem. We've all been very willing to go into these dirty spaces, right? These messed up, broken systems, and to be tokens just because we want representation, the allure of representation. We need to demand these spaces to be cleaned up first. Anti-racism training, you know, like anti-colonial training. And colonialism is another thing that I wanted to comment on, because when we were speaking about Trudeau and we were speaking about Canada and about how is it, you said in South Africa, a bill like that wouldn't even see the light of day, right? How is it that Canada has allowed something like this? My answer to that is that Canada was a colonial project. Our policies and our behaviors and our political kind of decision-making, they're all a product of the colonial project. It's going to take a hell of a lot of work for us to become decolonized. And that's the problem. We need decolonization, which is something that people get very uncomfortable by. And an example of decolonization would be to take stolen artifacts from museums and remove them, and to stop making money off of them. That's decolonization, but we're not willing to do that.
Your prime minister, I mean, he's a son of Pierre Trudeau. Would you view him as someone that presents a liberal front to a pluralistic society in light of the hypocrisy of the bill that is passed in Quebec? Or is it just simply surface level pleasing the electorate as politicians usually do?
Look, I always have to, you know, when somebody asks me about Justin Trudeau, I always have to kind of give. So there's my personal opinion, because I have met him several times. I've sat in rooms with him that are not being, you know, it's not a recorded interview. It's not a recorded meeting. It's him just being himself, sharing his feelings, his thoughts. And, you know, I see him personally, like on a personal level, person to person, human to human, Canadian to Canadian, when I hear him speak about things off camera, I see an individual, a good individual who wants to do, his intentions are all in the right place. He wants to do the right thing, but his hands are tied because he's part of...
Why is that the case, Sabreena? Why his hands...
Because he's part of a structure. And this is why we speak about structural inequality, right? And structural, institutionalized discrimination and Islamophobia and racism. It's all part of a system. It's systemic. And he's part of a system where the entire system is a problem, right? The entire process is a problem. So here we have one individual who has noble intentions, noble ideas, but in order for his noble ideas to come to life, he has to revamp the entire system, which he doesn't have the power to do. So on person to person, I cannot disparage him as a human being, as being a terrible human being. As a politician, I feel like he has made mistakes, where I don't know how much of that is his hands being tied and him not being able to say something bad, kind of advice from his closest, advisors, but he has made grave mistakes in his political career, which has led us to this moment. Mistakes and also inadequacies, maybe. But I do see Canada as being, and I have gone as far as to say that 2021 is a year of shame for Canadians. It really is. I feel like in the future, we're going to be teaching children in schools about the year 2021 and how shameful it was, because I don't know if you're aware of, the graves of Indigenous children that were recovered over the summer, hundreds, mass graves of children from residential schools. And these were recovered over the summer. And it was such a shock. And it was so painful, this was the first time I saw immigrant communities, Muslim communities, people who are new to, the history, the Indigenous history of Canada, who were in shock and awe about these graves, who all banded together and said, we shouldn't be celebrating Canada Day this year.
These were massacres. These graves were graves of the Indigenous over the centuries that were massacred by were these modern day massacres, 19th, 20th century?
Basically, the residential schools which existed over the entire kind of time of colonization. But the last Indigenous school that was closed down was 1996. We were alive. We were alive and breathing and going to our schools, and residential schools existed. These were Indigenous children. So in the earlier times, Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and taken to these schools, boarding schools, residential schools, where they were stripped of their culture and their identity, and the Christian education and religion, it was enforced on these children. And during that time, so where these graves and these killings come about is that there was malnutrition, there was violence, abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Children would die under the care of some of these priests and nuns, and it was a joint project of the state and of the church.
What figures are we looking at?
Numbers. So
what are the numbers like?
Right now, they found graves of hundreds. Okay, but at the time there were thousands of children reported missing. Thousands. So we haven't recovered them. The question is not that we just found graves of hundreds of children. The question is that we haven't found yet graves of thousands of Indigenous children.
It's a shame on the Canadian leadership. It's like what happened in New Zealand with the Aborigines, and in Australia, the kind of mass extermination. It's like a parallel process there.
genocide. It was genocide against this
genocide.
So what I'm saying is that, the point that I was trying to make earlier was that 2021 is a year of shame for Canada. I mean, the fact that you don't even know about something so big that happened in Canada, this embarrassing moment in Canadian history where graves of children, were recovered, and around the world, people don't know about this.
We don't know. We've never heard of this.
We didn't hear of this. And at the same time, in June, a Muslim family was run over by a white supremacist young man who killed them because he thought they were Muslim, he believed they were Muslim, and he was targeting Muslims. An entire family was killed on the sidewalk. To think that in a modern, civilized nation that around the world is seen as this beacon of hope, right? Trudeau is looked at as this beacon of hope. The comparison was always made with Trump. You had this crazy old man Trump, and then you had Trudeau, this sophisticated looking young man, who is this beacon of hope for Canadians, and let's pack our bags and move to Canada. But when you hear about the graves of Indigenous children, and then not to say that this happened under his watch, but the point is that what kind of policies have we seen put in place since then? What has happened to show that Canada is ashamed of its past? Canada Day was not cancelled. Many people decided not to observe Canada Day, but at the time I had interviewed with Toronto Star, and I had said to them, I believe there needs to be a absolute cancellation of Canada Day so that we can it should be a day of mourning. We should be mourning these children who were found, recovered just 3 weeks ago. It was 3 weeks before Canada Day.
I'm speechless. I'm literally speechless. And just help us, for those who don't know, what does Canada Day celebrate? What does that celebrate?
It's the Day of Independence, independence.
From the British and the French.
Yeah, the French, and the British. So it, it's embarrassing. It's like a very ugly past, which South Africa had, New Zealand had. A lot of these countries we're a part of have very ugly pasts. And my kind of, I guess, position as an academic, as a researcher, as an intellectual in this area is that we can't brush our ugly past under the rug because it's connected to our present. Our past is connected to our present because Islamophobia is connected to colonization. It's the mindset of the colonizer. The colonizer's mindset is seen through the ways in which Islamophobia presents itself, and in institutionalized ways. So, for example, recently, just 5 days ago, I don't know if you heard, but the Canadian Medical Association Journal. So this is the biggest journal in medicine in Canada. Published a letter, written by a pediatric surgeon. He wrote a letter, so it was a letter to the editor, but presented as an article, which was published by the Canadian Medical Association Journal, that said, it basically called the hijab an instrument of oppression. I can't remember the title, and I don't want to misquote it.
You said the Canadian Medical Journal alluded to the hijab being an instrument of oppression.
An instrument of oppression. So a week or so earlier, or a few days earlier, a article was published, and the cover of the article or the journal showed two young girls, maybe 5, 6 years old, 4, 5 years old, and one of the little girls was wearing a hijab, and the other little girl wasn't. So it was just a picture. But he, as a pediatric surgeon, felt that picture should not have been on there because hijab is an instrument of oppression, and he said it's akin to child abuse and child rape. So he connected it to child abuse and child rape. And this was published in a medical journal. So you can imagine the backlash it received. Within hours, Twitter was, people were like just met doctors who were serving, like, hijab wearing doctors who were currently taking care of Canadians in the pandemic were writing and saying, I have just been reduced to this stereotype, this bigotry, because of this article. 3 days later, the article was a big apology was given by the chief editor, and the article was removed, but it took 3 days. It took 3 days. And at the time, I said, this is an example of the ways in which Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment is institutionalized. It's not, here, we're not seeing Muslims being murdered, gunned down, but the type of, Islamophobia, we spoke about Orientalism and Islamophobia and how it impacts ordinary people. And then it inspires them to act out in violent ways. So
it inspires the ignorant then act out these particular actions based on the kind of ideological brainwashing that they persistently undergo. Again, I was not aware of this particular article that you've responded to, the journal that you've in fact alluded to. We're going to wrap up shortly, but I want to ask this issue. Have we as Muslims, and I'm talking now, well, certainly you can speak within the Canadian context, but obviously have the ability to view the situation globally through, prism, whatever the case is. Have we ourselves, have we contributed to the Islamophobia by creating insular societies, by, for example, internalizing some of the demons that has been projected on the Muslim psyche for centuries? I mean, if you, for example, look at the idea that Muslim communities are backward, they're inherently anti-intellectual, they're barbaric and so on. This was a crusader-like Oriental stereotype. This was always part and parcel of the dominant discourse in a demeaning way. And of course, modern manifestations today. But have we internalized that? I mean, when you look, for example, at the Taliban government, I mean, there's a new government in place. But I mean, the societies that we have in the Muslim world, and perhaps even within Muslim leadership in the West and in our own communities, are they contributory factors to which then give some degree of credence and credibility to the origin of these anti-Islamic sentiments? And the fact that we have created patriarchal societies, we have been insular in many mosques. And I'm talking about within the South African context, Muslim women don't have a voice, many organizations and committees. I know initially one of the criticisms which I had received for this forum was that there were very few female participants, which I've tried to remedy by having you on board. But have we created insular societies which then legitimize the critique that is leveled against Muslim communities? What do you see? I mean, what do you see in relation to that?
So I would take it back, like peeling the onion to the roots for us to see where all this begins. And I would argue, so misogyny, patriarchy is not a problem just for Muslims. It's a problem everywhere, right? Like people will tend to fall into the trap of misogyny, and patriarchal systems seem to rule generally everywhere, in America too.
But I just want to interrupt you. They're saying this is a difference. They will say, well, look, misogyny is true. It's in all other societies. But the difference is it's institutionalized by Islam, you see, so therefore therein lies a problem. This is what the argument is, that yes, you have it in other communities, but the distinction is that whilst there may be cultural phenomenon within the Islamic community, it's legitimized. This is part of your religion. This is what your religion preaches. Therefore, when you behave or act in a particular way, or you patriarchal, or you internalize these very same demonic manifestations that people superimpose on you, you're just simply being a good Muslim. This is what your religion teaches. That's a problem that we have and are facing.
I would argue that colonialism and Western kind of imperialism, and so the American project in Afghanistan created tribal governments, right? So what happens, war, poverty, social inequality gives birth or feeds like tribal systems, which are usually led by men who are misogynistic. And that's where I feel like, reverse back to like the Afghanistan government prior to the US invasion, they were not misogynistic or patriarchal in that sense. Women looked very different. Afghanistan was a very, for lack of a better word, a modern society, right? It wasn't the way that we see it now. Women in burqas, many did wear them out of choice, but it wasn't something that was enforced. In my opinion, what creates these types of tribalistic, patriarchal, misogynistic enforcements in these countries is war, poverty, social inequality, usually led by, caused by foreign influence. It's actually the foreign influence that gives birth to these places. And a lot of
colonial project, it's a kind of like the Taliban were more of a reactionary phase to the invasion of Afghanistan. ISIS is a reactionary phase. I mean, you never had radicalism during the Ba'athist as oppressive as it was during the Ba'athist regime. Then that takes me to the next approach, is that Muslims living in the West, all of us, and a lot of us believe that our system and the Islamic value system is not something that is inherently relativistic. It shouldn't be reduced to relativism in the sense of a separation between the church and the state, but it can be very much influential in building and uplifting society. So most Muslims, for example, have this claim, that they've got an archetype of what the Sharia really means. Although the manifestations of the implementation of the Sharia may not be the ideal in Muslim countries, and indeed as imposed by Muslim governments. When, for example, they have this archetype of calling for the implementation of the Sharia or a Muslim personal law or rights, would I be correct, is that this should not lead to an inherent fear amongst the majority population or amongst governments, because for many Muslims, the idea in terms of implementing Islam in society is a very idealistic sense of implementation, not something which is inherently dictatorial, oppressive, or dominating towards other people or impositional on them. So my question would be is that how do we make this a reality in the sense of reducing this level of fear? When people hear the term Sharia, when they hear the term Islamic law, they automatically think about cutting off your hands, Islamic punishment, a death penalty, death for apostasy, and all of that. What's our role in breaking that cycle of misinformation out there?
I mean, really, it's people like us, ordinary people, normalizing. I know normalizing is like the word of 2021. Like I've heard that word more than any other word all year long. But, normalizing the word Sharia, normalizing Allahu Akbar, like some of these terms that have been like affiliated to, extremism and terrorism. Like if you ask the average person, they would think that the word Sharia only applies to terrorism and extremism, when that is obviously not the case. But I feel like as Muslim intellectuals, as public figures, and many are already doing it, like Dalia Mugahid and so many other, public figures speak about these terms and these words and they tell stories and anecdotes around these words, and they're normalizing them. So we're taking the definition away, right? Like, we're changing the definition. We're stripping the negative connotations. And I think that's the only way to really, in an organic way, because we can scream from the top of our lungs that, this is not true, until it becomes part of people's regular vernacular, it's not going to have impact or effect. So we need to, like, as an academic, I see it as a responsibility as a practicing Muslim, but also as someone who's a social justice advocate, to not shy away from, and I said this recently, that in the past, I would not speak or study or write about Muslim issues because I was afraid that I was pigeonholing myself, right? That Muslims only speak about Muslims, like I wanted to be seen as an academic who has broader understanding, which I do. I'm a sociologist, I speak about immigration. It includes everything, but I would shy away from being labeled. I was worried about the labeling, right? But I feel more so now than ever before that it's very important for Muslims, people who, are practicing Muslims, who distort some of these stereotypical, visions of what a Muslim woman looks like, especially, to speak about issues pertaining to us, academic issues, intellectual issues, normalizing some of these words without fearing that label. Because that's the only way that we're going to change the narrative is if we speak about it. And that's why I think, a program like this is so important. And I want to thank you for including, a Muslim woman, because I think that when you speak about Islamophobia, it is imperative to include Muslim women's voices and Muslim women's stories and the impact on Muslim women, because I do feel like Muslim women are dehumanized. Muslims in general have been dehumanized by the Islamophobia industry. As refugees, Syrian refugees were dehumanized, and, terrorism has been associated to us and to Islam. So, we're dehumanized, and our faith has become dehumanized. We as faithful people have become dehumanized, but Muslim women in particular, because what we wear, how we look, our physical appearance is at the forefront. How we speak, how we present ourselves. And, the fact that we stand on these two extremes of either the only two types of women who have been given a platform are the women who are oppressed and the women who leave Islam. That big gray area in between where all the rest of us fall into that, we are not given a platform. Our voices have not been given a platform. People like Ayaan Hirsi Ali have been given a platform because they feed the narrative. And women who are, oppressed are given that platform. So it's either you're a Muslim woman, but you're only a Muslim woman because you're forced to be Muslim, or if you have any kind of, like power, you've left Islam. You see how we're made powerless. The people who have chosen.
So you're given a voice. So you're given a voice if you've apostatized from Islam, you're given a prominent voice, someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or if you've been subjected to oppression, purportedly, like I forget the school girl from Afghanistan. I believe she's moved to Canada. I forget her name, the one who was shot by the Taliban.
Malala Yousafzai.
Malala Yousafzai. Was Malala Yousafzai a tool? I mean, was she a convenient tool used by Western propagandists and the Western media? I mean, she was like a boon to them to say, look, this simply confirms everything that you've got to say. But she played into that. I mean, certainly, she experienced something which was bad and atrocious, but she played into that subsequently, giving fuel to the narrative, as I understand. And there are a lot of people like that in the world today.
Absolutely. And, I have been critical of this Malala narrative for a long time, not to say that it didn't happen to her.
What's the problem with that narrative? What's the problem with the narrative?
The problem with the narrative is exactly what I explained before. It falls in these two extremes, right? So my argument is not that people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali don't exist, shouldn't exist, or should be disparaged, or should, that we should. My whole, as a sociologist who comes from a social psychology background, I believe in stories and storytelling as being very powerful, change makers in society. But what I'm pointing to is this idea that the missing stories, right? So I believe Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story is important. I believe Malala Yousafzai's story is important because it points to the problems that do exist. The issue that I have is that not enough airtime is given to the other stories, which makes us very limited, as limited beings who can only be one or the other. And Malala's story, as true as it was, as problematic as it was, it feeds the Western narrative. So my criticism is not of Malala as an individual. My criticism is of the platform that is suspicious, right? So what's suspicious is the platform her voice has been given, because it feeds this Islamophobia narrative. And it saddens me that people like Malala and others like her, don't see that they are being used as tools.
Could you blame her? I mean, the other argument, the other side of the coin is that they will say, well, could you blame her? The fact that she was shot by the Taliban. I mean, what do you do in a situation like that? Then you just simply turn against everything that you turn against your own identity. It seems to be that she's turned against her own identity because of the actions of an extremist faction.
So I actually don't see Malala as turning against her own identity. Okay. I'd say Ayaan Hirsi Ali is more of someone
she has
who rejected her identity. Someone like Malala, to me, just seems like quite a noble person. She has continued to wear a headscarf. She appears to be very celebratory of her Muslim identity. That's not the issue. The issue is not that she has left Islam or she's presenting Islam as something terrible. That's not my issue. My issue is that perhaps people like her don't see that her voice is being used to sell a greater, this bigger narrative that harms Muslims all round. That's what I have an issue with, is that, but going back to this whole onion and peeling the onion and what came first, you spoke about, Muslims and how much we contribute to these things. So there's this idea of internalized colonialism, right? And a lot of immigrants in the West fall into this trap. A lot of like South Asians in India and, South Asians in Pakistan, they fall into this trap of internalized colonialism. This is the impact that colonization has on individuals, where they can no longer see themselves out of the colonial lens. Right. So, and I have spoken about this openly, about the fact that, my father put so much emphasis on the English language and on me having mastery over the English language and my speech being perfect and eloquent in English. And I wasn't given the same training in my mother tongue. It was this internalized colonialism. Why did my father think that speaking really well in English was the most important thing that I had to do? To prove myself, to make a place in society, and I'll just quickly tell you, I know you want to wrap up, but I just want to quickly tell you one of the first interviews.
No, go ahead. It's fascinating listening to you on these so many experiences. Yeah.
One of the first interviews I gave on CBC, I got lots of feedback on it. And people, the one word that people kept using was just so eloquent. She's so eloquent. She speaks so well. And even till this day, one of the words that is just constantly used for me is my eloquence in English, how I speak. She speaks so well. And at that time, because I was receiving hundreds and hundreds of comments about my eloquence, I had this moment of self-reflection. And I thought to myself, what was the price that I paid for my eloquence? The price that I paid for my eloquence was that I lost out on eloquence in my mother tongue. I lost out on the opportunity to speak Urdu eloquently, to speak Pashto eloquently. These are the two languages of my ancestors that I can speak them, but can I give an interview like this in Urdu or, in Pashto? No, I absolutely cannot. And if somebody heard me speaking in Urdu, they would not be using the word eloquent, right, to describe me. And so the point that I'm trying to make is the fact that for my father, it became such an important, driving force. Like, you must speak well, you must become like, he is the reason why I'm as educated as I am, because he gave so much importance to education, but he didn't give importance to education in Urdu or me learning about my history and my ancestry. It was to become educated in the Western world and speak the Western lingo, right? So I am giving my story as an example of internalized colonialism, how it presents itself, how pervasive it is, and how it comes alive in immigrant communities, where we fall in love so much with the colonizers, language and culture, that we mirror it. And we feel like the only way we can be credible and valid is if, our validation comes from becoming more like our colonizers. And when I see people like Malala, I often use this word internalized colonialism because it's born of internalized. It's not some sort of like evil that she's doing. It's an effect. It's that internalized colonialism that presents itself.
I think it would give you any kind of semblance of support. One thing I can tell you is that in the South African context, most of us are third and fourth generation. We've got absolutely no linguistic connectivity with the vernacular. I mean, you said you can at least speak some degree of Urdu. I mean, most of us, my generation, certainly, and I think I'm third or fourth generation, we've got absolutely no connectivity with our past language and linguistics. And I think that's probably, it's a generational thing. As you go to the 21st century, the lingua franca, unfortunately or fortunately, is English globally. I do want to wrap up, but I just want to say something. If I were to walk in the streets of South Africa now, anything could happen. It's an extremely dangerous society. I want to ask you this question. As a Muslim woman, either dressed in hijab or somebody that is easily identified as a Muslim woman or a Muslim woman in general, with or without a hijab, is it dangerous for her to walk on the streets of Canada or the streets of Quebec when you hear multiple reports in Montreal of women being attacked, in Quebec, women being attacked, assaults taking place? Is it a dangerous place? Is Canada a dangerous place for Muslim women?
Absolutely, 100%. And I will, I say this with, my hand on my heart in respect for my, Muslim sisters who wear their hijab. I see them as warriors every day, going out there, committed to their faith, committed to this, commitment that they made to God. And I do feel weak in comparison that, I don't have that level of strength to go out there. I 100% believe that it opens you up more to discrimination, to racism, and to violence. I used to, when I was doing my PhD, many years ago when I was in the school system, I used to, be outside traveling quite a lot, far away from my university. And, when I would get to my car, I'd often read my salah I would always carry my prayer mat with me and read it just in the car park before getting in the car, to read it properly. I stopped doing that a few years ago because I was so afraid of being attacked and being visible as a Muslim woman with a hijab on outside. And that is a great loss. It's a great loss to me as an individual and my rights, my human rights and dignity, I feel like I've been stripped of that. But I just want to quickly say one thing before you wrap up, and that is that Muslim women are unsafe, not just on the streets because of this external marginalization, but they are unsafe inside their homes as well because of that internal marginalization. So one of the impacts of Islamophobia on Muslim women is that legitimate cases of domestic violence, legitimate cases of, you pointed to it, that yes, there is this, problem of that oppression of Muslim women that does exist sometimes within homes, right? Not because they're Muslim, but just because they're women. The problem that I see is that because of Orientalism and because our men have, been they've been turned into these, because of this terrorist narrative, and they're seen as these barbarians. A lot of Muslim women will shy away from fueling that narrative and making their men fit this mold or be described as that they will seal their mouths and they will take abuse, and they will be in situations where it's harmful because of Islamophobia. So Islamophobia has a twofold impact on women, because we are being, marginalized externally from non-Muslims, and we're unsafe if we're wearing our hijabs. But also inside the home, I would say that there are many Muslim women who will not speak up against real issues because of Orientalism. So dehumanization on multiple fronts.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your last sentence.
Just that, we're dehumanized in so many ways, and Muslim women, especially ones who, and I will say that I don't wear a hijab, so I am, it's less dangerous for me, and I don't experience the same things that other Muslim women experience. And I also want to quickly say that my skin color plays a factor. The way I speak English, and the way I look, oftentimes I can't be very easily identified as Muslim. So my experience as a Muslim woman is privileged. I have a privileged position, but the women who get it worse are Black Muslim women, especially ones who come from refugee backgrounds, or indigenous Muslim women. So once you add those intersections, it's a very intersectional, issue that you have to take into account, that race, class, immigrant status, gender, that all makes Islamophobia worse. If I've got three people here, I've got Pamela Geller, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Robert Spencer. If there is a message that you would like to give them or convey to them, what would that be? I would take the mic away from them.
Would you be willing to debate them or give them a platform for debate?
Absolutely. I mean, I've sat in debates with bigots many times, but especially someone like Pamela Geller, I feel like white women feminists need to be confronted, by Muslim feminists, and especially people who distort her kind of perceptions and what she sells as, the oppressed Muslim woman. I think especially someone like her and, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I feel like she's telling a story. She kind of falls a little bit into that category of Malala, where she had a story to tell and it got exploited. So she has been exploited. So I see her as a problem, but not as much as a problem as someone like Pamela Geller, because Pamela Geller is a product of that industry, that Islamophobia industry, that is looking to gain something, from, it's a white supremacist movement, an alt-right movement. Whereas with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I feel like she had a story to tell, a real story. It got kind of lapped up by, the white feminist, and she kind of got caught up in it, same as Malala. But Pamela Geller, I'd love to challenge her.
Asra Nomani, what would you say about her?
I don't know enough about Asra Nomani to be honest with you.
Okay.
What is some of?
Well, I've just seen some of her comments, and she purportedly speaks for and on behalf of Muslim women and presents a narrative about the oppression internally within mosques and Muslim societies in general. So I thought you may have had some sort of interaction with her. She's from the United States. I've seen a debate or discussion between her and Adina Lekovic some years back, and that's when I first came across her in terms of her prominence in terms of promoting the same narrative. Lastly, Dr. Sabreena.
Sorry, does she identify as Muslim?
She identifies as Muslim, but I think more in the category of someone like Majid Nawaz. If you probably heard of Majid Nawaz from the United Kingdom, in that particular kind of range, more somewhat secularized, and I think probably a very relativistic approach towards the Islamic worldview, where you kind of reduce the faith to just simply a sense of, personal pieties or whatever the case is. I think I probably have experienced. Lastly, if there's something you would like to say to the South African audience, there's a wide contingent of South Africans that are watching this. If there's something that you would like to say to South African Muslim community in terms of how they should interact with the broader dominant society, and of course, taking into account that we do live in a multicultural society with different communities, how should we make ourselves more visible and live out a true Islamic identity, which would confront the negativity and the stereotypes out there?
Well, first and foremost, since I'm speaking to South Africans, I think I would, want to give my condolences. We lost a giant, a social justice giant today.
Desmond Tutu.
With Desmond Tutu, loss of Desmond Tutu, and I have looked up to him and his, words, and his words have become a part of my life and my work that I do, fighting oppression and, advocating for social justice. So, my condolences. I think people probably look at South Africans and South Africa's, they connect Desmond Tutu with South Africa. So people are looking to you right now as South Africans and would love to hear from you. And I feel like this is a great time to speak up and share your words of wisdom and your thoughts about what's happening in your communities and your world. I think this is, judging by our conversation today, Yusuf, I would say as global as we are, as much as we're a globalized world, I do feel, and I share this often in my courses, in my classes, when I'm speaking to my students, that, we all live in bubbles. We're still in very specific social media information bubbles where we are not as connected as we think we are. Just the fact that you were not aware of so many of these very important things happening in Canada that is connected to Muslims in South Africa, right? And one of the interviews I gave after the Quebec mosque shooting here, when the New Zealand shooting happened, was I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the New Zealand shooter was heavily influenced by the Quebec mosque shooter. That there is a connection. Right-wing extremism and right-wing white supremacist ideology is connected around the world. I would say make a consistent effort to learn more about what's happening to Muslims around the world, because we are connected. Our stories are connected, and share your stories and hear other people's stories and stand up for justice. And this is my last piece of advice that I want to give, and that is that as Muslims, in order for us to be taken seriously and our social justice work to be taken seriously, we need to speak up for the injustices against other communities, other non-Muslim communities. And that's why earlier this summer, I spoke up so much about the, injustices against Indigenous people, Indigenous Canadians, because the suffering of one group is connected to the suffering of another group. And really, it's in that solidarity that we can all move forward. So that would be my last bit of, kind of advice and words of wisdom to South Africans, is to see what's happening to your neighbor as Muslims, and to speak up for other groups that are suffering, as well as your own ummah.
Well, it's been an absolute joy and an intellectual privilege to have you. We've learned so much. I've learned so much in this conversation that I've had with you. And that brings us to the end of this series of discussions that we've been having over this past week, where we've had this exciting lineup of speakers, scholars, and debaters. And today we've had Dr. Sabreena Ghaffar-Siddique, who has shared her experiences and her thoughts and her ideas with us. We hope to have her again. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace.